Assalamu alaikum. This is lecture number 6 in Pakistan Studies. The topic we are going to discuss today is the Khilafat movement. We will be discussing this topic with reference to 4 aspects. 1. What was the Khilafat movement? And what are the roots of the Khilafat movement? Second, dimensions of the Khilafat movement. 3, the Hijrat movement. 4, end of the movement and its impact on Muslim politics in South Asia. Let's take up the first section. That is, what was Khilafat movement and its roots? Khilafat movement was a religio-political movement launched by the Muslims of British India for the retention of Usmaniya Khilafat or Khilafat-e-Usmaniya, and for not letting the Muslim holy places go under the control of the non-Muslims. During the First World War, Turkey sided with Germany, and as Germany began to lose, Turkey also started losing its territory. By the time First World War came to an end in 1918, Turkey had lost most of its territory. Therefore, the issue at that time was, how would the Allied powers treat Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, or Khilafat-e-Usmaniya? And most of its territory had been occupied, and this movement was at its peak from 1919 to 1922, although it went on during the later years. What were the goals of this movement? 1. Ottoman Khilafat or Khilafat-e-Usmaniya should be kept intact. This was the first demand of the Khilafat movement that we are going to discuss very shortly. Second, the territorial solidarity of Turkey should be preserved. Third, the control of the holy places of Muslims should not be given to non-Muslims, that is, non-Muslim powers. This was the first major political movement launched by the Muslims in India, which involved the common man. You would recall that the Muslim League was set up in 1906, and Muslims had started demanding certain safeguards from the British. They were also interacting with the other community and the Congress Party. However, politics during that time, that is from 1906 to 1919, was the elitist politics. That is basically the people educated and also people who were well off, who could spare time, who could spare money, were involved in politics. Khilafat movement was the first movement where ordinary people were involved. Ordinary Muslims were involved. People in the street were involved. And therefore, for the first time, politics came down to the ordinary masses. Another important aspect of the Khilafat movement is that it showed the mobilization capacity of Islam amongst the Muslims. It clearly demonstrated the extent to which the Muslims of British India held Islam and Islamic institution dear to them. So it showed that Islam had lot of mobilizational capacity and appeal for the ordinary people. Another aspect emphasizes the extraterritorial attachments of the Muslims of India based on Islam. Extraterritorial means that people feel attached to certain institutions and ideological frameworks that may be beyond the territorial boundaries of their own country. That is extraterritorial attachments. Amongst the Muslims, extraterritorial attachments have always been very strong, and these extraterritorial attachments are based on Islam. Two concepts of Islam were very strong force for Muslims of British India. One, the concept of Ummah. And this concept, Ummah, that Muslims living all over the world, whether in this country or that country, belong to an ideological brotherhood of Islam. It's a community or sense of community based on principles and teachings of Islam. Therefore, concept of Ummah has lot of pull for the Muslims, and that could be seen during the period of Khilafat movement, even before that. The second thing that created extraterritorial sentiments amongst the Muslims of this region was the institution of Khilafat. The Khilafat-e Usmaniya, whose primary seat was in Turkey. And Khilafat-e Usmaniya was seen by Muslims of British India as a kind of continuity from the original institution of Khilafat in Islam. Therefore, they always paid much attention and much importance to the institution of Khilafat. You can go back to the earlier period, where you will find that the sentiment of attachment based on Islam were very strong. For example, if you go to 1910, 11 and 12, you find the Balkan Wars, which I have mentioned in one of my earlier lectures. In 1911 and 12, there was a war between Turkey and Italy had also attacked Libya. Therefore, during that time, 1911-12, when Balkan Wars were going on, the Muslims of British India demonstrated strong sentiments for Muslims, for Turkey. And a medical delegation was sent to Turkey to provide medical assistance to people affected by war. And now, in 1919, when First World War had come to an end, you had the same sentiments again emerging on the basis of concept of Ummah and also on the basis of the emotional attachment, sentimental attachment which the people had with the institution of Khilafat, and therefore there was a lot of sentiment and lot of support for the demand, that is retention of institution of Khilafat. And for this reason, Khilafat movement becomes extremely important if you want to understand the political developments of Muslims of India. Let's take up the second topic, that is dimensions of the Khilafat movement. If you look at the political history of British India during the 20th century, especially in the second and the third decade, you can also include the first decade, you will find that amongst Muslims there were poets, there were prose writers who were focusing on couple of common themes like degeneration and decline of Muslims in general, and Muslims of this region in particular, because the Muslims of this region were matter of their direct interest. So they were focusing on the decline and degeneration. Second theme which you find there is how to revive, how to regenerate, how to reclaim the past glory. And you can find that, for example, in the poetry of Allama Iqbal. If you read Bale Jibril, you read Shikwa and Jawab-e-Shikwa, you read Masjid-e-Kartaba, where all these themes are very strong, and the emphasis is that Muslims could regain, could recover from their problems if they focus on Islam, if they develop a genuine spirit of Islam. If you read Musaddas-e-Hali, you will find the same story, decline of Muslims and how Muslim could, come out of all the problems which they were facing. So these kind of sentiments were very strong when Khilafat movement started. If you go back to the period immediately before Khilafat, you find that here there were several newspapers being printed in India by Muslims, and those newspapers were pleading the cause of Muslims. During Balkan War, they were supporting the Muslims, and as things moved towards the end of the First World War and the issue of Khilafat movement developed, then these newspapers were focusing on that issue. I can mention few just to substantiate the point which I am making. For example, Zimidar newspaper by Maulana Zafar Ali Khan is one such example, which was reflecting the genuine sentiment of Muslims of this region about what was happening to them and also to the Muslims as a whole. Then we can talk about Comrade newspaper and Hamdard newspaper of Maulana Muhammad Ali Johar. And Al-Hilal, this was the newspaper of Maulana Abul Kalam Azad. All these newspapers were focusing on the Muslims and their conditions. Now, First World War came to an end in 1918, And in 1919, the major peace treaty, Treaty of Versailles, was signed, and it was very obvious from the kind of treaty that was that ultimately Turkey would lose all what it had. Then in 1920, the terms and conditions of peace with Turkey were made known. And those were very humiliating conditions for Turkey. Turkey had lost most of its territory. Territory had been taken away from Ottoman Khilafat. Even on the mainland Turkey, that is Turkey as it stands today, even on the mainland Turkey, foreign forces were present. That is, mainland Turkey was also occupied. And it was in this context that Muslims of this region started a movement that is described as the Khilafat movement. And all this started as a kind of a movement in 1919. In 1919, All India Khilafat Committee was set up at Bombay in July 1919. And this gradually shaped up as the focal point of Muslim activity regarding Khilafat. And in this Khilafat Committee session, they were discussing the issues of Khilafat, which held the first Khilafat conference in Delhi in November 19. That is November 1919. And in this first Khilafat conference, not only Khilafat Committee, but Muslim League and Congress leaders also participated. Congress was also beginning to support the Khilafat movement for the reasons that I will discuss later on. Now, in this first meeting, they made certain, demands, and also they decided to take certain steps. One important decision taken by the participants of the first Khilafat conference was that they would boycott the victory celebrations. That is, the Allied powers, the British had won the war, and British were celebrating even in India, because India, being a part of the British Empire, was automatically on the side of the British. Therefore, these people decided to boycott all the celebrations which were to be observed by the British government, to show their displeasure on the state of affairs and to express their point of view in an effective and forceful manner. So they thought that boycott of celebrations would be useful. Second decision which they made here was that they would start boycotting the British goods. In a way, a kind of economic policies which they were adopting, that they would start boycotting British goods. They will not buy British goods, which would affect ultimately the British economy. And the third important decision which they made at that time was that not at this stage, but at later stage, they may also launch some kind of non-cooperation movement against the British. So this was a beginning of the conference and movement. Now, the second Khilafat conference was held at Amritsar in December 1919, and this was a very important occasion. Like the first one, all major political parties participated. Congress was also there, and the most significant thing was that Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar and Maulana Shaukat Ali, who were in British detention for violating British law in protest against the British policies, were released, and they came directly to this meeting. In fact, you can't discuss Khilafat movement without discussing the contribution of Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar and Maulana Shaukat Ali, and they used to be described as the Ali brothers because both were a brother. So you can't discuss Khilafat movement without talking about these two brothers who played very significant role in mobilizing Muslim masses. They had formidable appeal at the common level. They also worked with the Congress party, and both brothers, along with other leaders, went to prison several times. They would come out, demonstrate for Khilafat, lead Muslims. The British would arrest them along with other leaders. But whenever they are released, they would again come back and plead that cause with conviction. After that, the Khilafat Conference and the Congress Party began to work together. It was decided that they would work together because there were issues in India which were agitating others as well. Those issues were important for Muslim, but Muslim attention was primarily focused on the Khilafat. There were other issues which were agitating the Congress, and the Congress thought that Muslims have a set of grievances against the British. They are agitating for retention of Ottoman Khilafat. Then the Congress also had grievances against the British. So they thought that if they work together, if they cooperate, collaborate, then they can have more effective impact rather than two movements working separately. And the issues that were agitating at that time, one was the question of Roulette Act. This was a law which the British government passed for arresting, detaining people who would be involved in what they would describe as criminal activities, but actually those were political activities. And those people could be punished severely and without trial. So this bill, which was ultimately made into law, was protested both by the Muslims as well as by the Hindus, the Congress and the Muslim League. I may mention here that when this issue developed, that is the issue of the Roulette Act of 1919, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah was the member of the Legislative Council, Central Legislative Council. He was very critical of this act. He delivered his critical speeches in the Legislative Council and outside. And ultimately, he resigned his seat of the assembly in protest against this law, because he thought that this act is a humiliating act, violates basic canons of justice and fair play. So this was one issue. The second issue that was agitating people across the religious divide was the incident relating to the Jallianwala Bagh. Jallianwala Bagh was situated in the city of Amritsar, and against the backdrop of this Rowlatt Act, a big meeting was held in that bagh or garden. There were all kinds of people, and the British government was so agitated that they dispatched a unit of the army that went into the garden, blocked all the entrance point, and began shooting directly on the people. And several hundred people were killed and seriously wounded, which created a major uproar throughout India. And it is during this period that the British imposed martial law in Amritsar and in certain other cities of the province of Punjab, including Lahore, Gujranwala, and a couple of other cities. Martial law was imposed. So in a way, that becomes the first martial law in this region in the 20th century. After 20th century, this was the first instance. So this Jallianwala Bagh incident also mobilized Congress and other groups to move ahead and to pool their resources and to challenge the authority of the British government. Therefore, the famous Congress session was held at Nagpur in December 1920, when the Congress party, at the instance of the Congress leader Mahatma Gandhi, adopted his non-violent, non-cooperation movement. This was the first non-cooperation movement which Gandhi was launching. He launched a couple of other movements subsequently. And the general agreement was that Indians would return all those titles which the British had given to them. For example, one title which used to be given to the Indians for their services was the title of Sir. And several Indians use the title of Sir with their names. And there were several other titles. So the decision was that they would return that title. Second, boycott of the courts, of educational institutions. Then they would resign their jobs. It was also decided that at a later stage, not at that stage, but at a later stage, they would start resigning from police and the army. It was something which they kept in reserve. This was not really launched, but something which they thought could be implemented later on. A Khilafat conference was held in Karachi in 1921. And in this Khilafat conference, the participants, predominantly Muslims, showed their or demonstrated their or reiterated their loyalty to the institution of Khilafat, which by that time had been dispossessed of its territory by the Allied powers, the British and the others. And they had also decided to keep the movement going. Third, they welcomed Ataturk's efforts to dislodge foreign forces from Turkish mainland. By that time, Ataturk was emerging as a leader, and he was taking steps to expel the foreign forces from Turkey. And it was at a very early stage, but nevertheless, they welcomed that, and they thought that it's something that needs to be encouraged and needs to be endorsed. While this movement was going on, with total Muslim commitment, with dedication, with full sincerity, the Muslims were making their point of view known, their loyalty, their attachment known by making all these kinds of sacrifice. Now, while all this was happening, another movement was started here. That was called the Hijrat movement, which is the third aspect of our topic today, the Hijrat movement, that primarily was there between 1920 and 1921. What was the Hijrat movement? The Hijrat movement was encouraged by religious leaders who declared that India has become a Darul Harb, where Muslims are not safe, and they should move from Darul Harb to Darul Islam. And in this case, Darul Islam was next door country, Afghanistan. So the religious leaders, the Islamic leaders, scholars, leaders of political parties, encouraged Muslims to move from India to Afghanistan. That is what is Hijrat, that you go from this country to a country which is a Muslim country, next door country, Afghanistan. There was another reason why this movement was launched. The general impression was that the king of Afghanistan would welcome these people who would go from India to Afghanistan. Therefore, because of the encouragement which Islamic leaders gave to the common people, and a perception that Afghanistan will welcome anybody who goes there, a very large number of people, especially belonging to the lower strata of society, the common people, the poor people, left India and began to travel towards Afghanistan, some on foot, some in carts, because means of transportation were not so developed at that time that you could easily go to Afghanistan. And some of these people sold their property here at very cheap rate, disposed of the property, because they were moving from this place to other place in the name of Islam. So they began going to Afghanistan. Initially, the Afghanis welcomed the Muslims, those were migrating from India to Afghanistan. But as their number increased, as they were going there in a large number. It went into thousands, and some writings say into lakhs. The Afghan government closed the border, did not allow them to enter Afghanistan, because Afghanistan was also a poor country, also had its own problems, and it was not able to cope with the people who were coming from India to Afghanistan. Therefore, they stopped them coming into Afghanistan. And this created a major dilemma for the Muslims who were migrating to Afghanistan. They wanted to go to Afghanistan, but they could not enter Afghanistan. Now, going back was, in most cases, was difficult, because they had sold their property. They had lost most of what they had, and where should they go back? Some of them, especially the old people, died on the way, because it was painful to travel at that time. So in a way, this Hijrat movement added to the miseries and problems of the Muslims, because it was unplanned and it was based on emotions, not taking into account the realities in Afghanistan. And Muslims did suffer. However, Hijrat movement reinforces what I had said in the beginning. That is, the total commitment and identification of Muslims to Islam, and their ability to make all kind of sacrifices for the ideology, for the principles and teachings of Islam. That was very obvious. I may mention one point as a kind of a footnote to the Hijrat movement, and a kind of a secondary point to the Hijrat movement. Some of the Muslims who were able to cross over and go into Afghanistan gradually moved to Soviet Union, and they stayed there, and some of them came back to India subsequently. While in the Soviet Union, they were inspired by Soviet socialist and Marxist philosophy, and some of them when they came back were active in socialist and Marxist movements in India. This was a kind of a footnote. But the overall, Hijrat movement did create problems and hardships for the Muslims of this region. Let's take up the next issue, or next aspect, that is the end of the movement. The Khilafat movement that was started by the Muslims of British India for the retention of the institution of Ottoman Khilafat or Khilafat-e-Usmaniya, and for retaining the control of Muslim holy places. That movement gradually fizzled out. How did that happen? Number of developments from 1921 onwards contributed to that. The first important development that adversely affected the movement was the Mopala revolt on the Malabar area in Calicut. This incident took place in 1921. Mopalas were Muslims. They revolted against their Hindu landlord. The issue was not religious. It was not because they were predominantly Muslim and they were predominantly Hindus, therefore that uprising. The uprising was against the injustice, against the sufferings, against the hard time which the Mopalas were facing. And as they revolted, the police took the sides of the landlord, the zimidars, and local Hindu groups and Hindu organizations began to project this as a kind of Hindu-Muslim issue. There was a lot of propaganda against Muslims with reference to this uprising. And there were calls by some of the Hindu organizations that they should wake up, they should get up, and they should unite to face the kind of challenge that is emerging. Now, this uprising had a negative impact on Hindu-Muslim unity that was being demonstrated in the Khilafat movement. As I said earlier, that the Congress Party and the Khilafat Committee and others were very active in the movement. They were cooperating, they were working together. In fact, Maulana Muhammad Ali Jauhar, Maulana Shaukat Ali, Maulana Zafar Ali Khan, and other Muslim leaders were addressing meetings along with Gandhi and others. So it was a rare demonstration of Hindu-Muslim unity. And that cooperative sentiment was undermined by this incident. The second incident that affected the whole movement was the increase of violence. When in 1920, non-cooperation movement was launched by Gandhi, it was argued that this would be a peaceful movement, this would be a non-violent movement, no violence would be used, but Indians would demonstrate against the British in a peaceful manner, and even if the British use force on them, they will not respond. However, with the passage of time, violence entered this non-cooperation movement. One important incident was Chora Chori incident. This is a small place in Uttar Pradesh, UP. And here what happened was that the Congress activists attacked a police station as a part of agitation against the British, put the police station on fire. As a result, about 21 policemen were burnt alive. And there were other incidents of violence. Because of this violence, Gandhi suddenly decided to call off the non-cooperation movement. Gandhi's decision did affect the movement. Firstly, it was a sudden and individual decision, not consulting the Khilafat movement people, because they were working together. And suddenly, the non-cooperation movement was called off, which affected adversely the movement, and also created distrust between the two groups that were operative at that time. So this was an incident that weakened the movement, and they began to diverge, move in different directions. Third and most significant development relates to Turkey itself. Things began to change in Turkey. As I had mentioned a couple of minutes ago, that in Turkey, Kemal Mustafa Pasha Ataturk, who was in the military service of the Ottoman Empire, collected his colleagues together and undertook operations against the occupying foreign forces. And he was able to expel the foreign forces. And this strengthened his position, and gradually he emerged as the leader of New Turkey that was emerging in place of the Ottoman Empire. In November 1922, the new political arrangements under Ataturk that had developed there restricted powers of the Sultan, Ottoman Sultan. In fact, Sultan Abdul Hamid was replaced by another person. Then in October 23, Ataturk was elected head of the state. Turkey became republic. And in March 1924, the Grand National Assembly, the Parliament of Turkey, abolished the institution of Khilafat. So, in a way, the very institution for which the Muslims were fighting had been replaced by Turkey, the new leadership, or the modern or national Turkey that emerged, the present-day Turkey that emerged in 1922 and 23. As Khilafat was abolished, the movement gradually became weak and gradually disappeared. And this is how Khilafat movement ended. I could conclude that by drawing some lessons, in a way, a conclusion of what I have been discussing. The whole Khilafat movement and the Hijrat movement clearly demonstrated the role of religion, that is, role of Islam in the life of the Muslims of South Asia, the centrality of Islam, its mobilizational capacity that was clearly demonstrated during this period of Khilafat movement, something which was not forgotten by the leaders of Pakistan movement who later on invoked Islam for mobilizing people for Pakistan movement. Muslims had to suffer a lot, especially because of the Khilafat movement. Another important thing was that the Hindu-Muslim unity that was demonstrated during Khilafat movement began to erode, began to disappear. The Hindu-Muslim unity proved very short-lived. An experiment did not really succeed. And Muslims learned to stand on their feet and to fight for their rights, fight for their identity. Students, this concludes our discussion of the Khilafat movement. Khuda Hafiz, until we meet again.